Welcome to Music from Humans. In this episode, I'm thrilled to reconnect with Joseph Klein, a composer whose work is as thought-provoking as it is boundary-pushing. Joe's compositions blend structured forms with improvisation and theatrical elements, creating captivating experiences for performers and audiences alike. Joe is not only a distinguished teaching professor at the University of North Texas, but also one of my own composition teachers. With a career spanning instrumental, vocal, electroacoustic,
I wanted to reach up and shut my own eyes just before I died.
and intermedia music, his work draws inspiration from fractal geometry, natural phenomena, and literature. Recognized by organizations like the National Endowment for the Arts and the American Music Center, his music has been performed across the globe, solidifying his place as a major voice in contemporary music. Today, we'll dive into his longest-running project, Canetti-Menagerie. Inspired by Elias Canetti's Earwitness 50 characters, this collection of solo pieces has grown over nearly 30 years into a theatrical work brimming with improvisation, collaboration, and open-ended form. But how does a series of solo compositions transform into something so dynamic and theatrical? Stick around and find out as we uncover the story behind Canetti-Menagerie. Well, Joe, it is so great to have you on Music from Humans.
It's great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, Michael.
Well, I'm real excited to have you because you're one of the composers that I've known the longest. I've known you since the early 90s when you were my college composition professor who helped me graduate and get out of UNT.
Remember that very well, and it's like we only overlapped a year. I was just with you during your senior year, as I recall, and you were one of my first students, and I were a very memorable student. So it's really great to be back here again and get caught up and chat a little bit.
One of the things that we have in common. You're a bassoonist, I'm a bassoonist, you like Frank Zappa, and I love Frank Zappa. The other thing that we seem to have developed in parallel that is in common is our interest in open-ended forms and music that has improvisational aspects to it. And that's become super important in my work. And you have some big applications of this in various modular compositions that you have. I find these works incredibly intriguing, and you've got one particular work, Canetti-Menagerie. This is a collection of solo.
All solo pieces, right? 4 to 7 minutes, most of them in that range.
Right. And they're in various styles, and you've written them over, what, 30 years?
27 years now.
27 years?
Yeah. I started in 1997, so it's been a while.
Yeah. I would love to talk about this piece, which, by my reckoning, you're only halfway finished with.
I don't know that I'll ever finish it actually. So, yeah, as you mentioned, Elias Canetti is or was a Bulgarian writer and also lived in Austria, lived in England. So he wrote in German actually, and he wrote these 50 character studies. So I've only done 22 solo pieces based on those so far. I don't think I'm going to make it to all 50 because I'm not writing them fast enough. But I'm doing my best.
One thing I noticed with that is you don't have a bassoon yet for this.
I do have contrabassoon though.
You have contrabassoon, but you don't have regular bassoon. I no longer own a contrabassoon. You need to crank out a bassoon
I do.
so I could play it sometime.
Yeah, you're right. I feel like I've neglected my own instrument by leaving off the bassoon, but maybe one of these days that'll be on the. I do have in the book the Canetti book. In fact, oddly enough, it happens to be right here on my desk. The book that I had on in those pages as I first started reading this. This is in 1997. I first started working on these solo pieces based on the characters in that book. And as I was reading the book for the first time, like halfway through it, I just started thinking like these would be really great like kind of inspirational, like just inspiration for solo pieces. And so I started just writing in the margins of the book what instruments I thought I had in mind for each of the characters, and I'd say about half of them probably by the end of the book I had put instruments down. I think I've got one in there that's marked for bassoon. So if I ever write that bassoon Canetti piece, I already know what the character is going to be. So, interesting. Like I said, I was reading that book and I got kind of familiar with Canetti because in the '80s, I was in Indiana University as a doctoral student, and one of my friends that was there was a conductor, Chris Russell, who's actually conducted a couple pieces of mine. He's out of California at Azusa Pacific University. Um, he introduced me to this composer, Magnus Lindberg, who's a Finnish composer. And Lindberg at the time was writing these kind of abstract pieces, and one of the pieces was based on this book by Canetti called Crowds and Power. And I was really interested in that book, so I read the book, and I just kind of got obsessed with this writer. And when I moved to Texas, we have a used bookstore here. You probably remember when you lived here, recycled books is still here. And I every time I go in there, I look for another Canetti book because I was just kind of obsessed with his writing, and it covers like all different genres. And I found this little thin book of 50 character studies. And so this is like 1996 or so. And I started reading it. Like I said, I started making notes about halfway through it. And then I had an opportunity to write a solo bass piece for a friend of mine who was in the Indianapolis Symphony at the time, a bass player. So it's like, got my first, I got a character for that. And so I wrote that. And then I wrote a violin one. And then over the years, every time there was an opportunity to write a solo piece, I would just go for one of those characters and grab them. Most of them I'd already had written in the margins what instruments I was going to use. So I pretty much knew where to go. And over 27 years, I've written 22 solo pieces. So that's and it's kind of ebbed and flowed. Like there were a few years where I wasn't writing a lot of them, and some years I wrote like 3 of them. And again, it had to do with who I was working with and what instruments I was interested in writing for. Sometimes it's a person I want to work with, like a performer. Other times it's an instrument I just really dying to write for, and I'm looking for a performer. The cello solo piece called Die Schadhafte, I'd had that in my mind for like 10 years before I met the cellist Madeline Shapiro and said, "Okay, that's the cellist I'm gonna write for because the stuff she does just totally lined up with my aesthetic." And same thing with the piano, solo, Der Sausenblaus. I had that in my mind for probably about 15 years before I found a pianist that I got to know, Rady Lupa, and it was like he just clicked. His work kind of clicked with me. So in a way, these kind of characters have found the performers, over the years, which has been kind of an interesting process.
Awesome. I got really interested in how this evolved into the work
Yeah,
conversations and Canetti-Menagerie as larger performance type piece.
right. So, this probably started back, I think it's in 2011, the New Music Ensemble in Dallas, Voices of Change. They had invited me to do kind of like a salon concert at one of their donors' houses in Dallas. And so they wanted to do several of these Canetti pieces. And at that time, I'd never done them as a group at all. They'd always been done these individual pieces, right? So this is the first time that we had a chance to do several of them together. And so we're at this house, this kind of like I said, salon, and I had 5 of the performance, 5 of the pieces for percussion, bass flute, trumpet, contrabassoon, and violin. So those are the 5 that we ended up picking. And I thought, since they're all part of a collection, maybe what I'll do between the pieces is read the text, from the Canetti book because they're very short character studies. They're each like 2 pages long. They're takes you like 2 minutes to read. So I thought this would be kind of fun. We got 5 pieces. They're all like 4 to 7 minutes, so it's not a long program. I'll just fill in the gaps in between with these, with conversation with the Canetti excerpts. So we did that, and I would read, and then they would play a piece, and I'd read the character, and they'd play the piece. And then in the about that, well, maybe a couple years later, I had done a recording on the Innova label, and I had like 11 of those collected. And I found out there was an artist in Germany that had done these paintings. They look like old expressionist woodcuts, and he was doing these Canetti characters. I was like, oh, excited that there was an artist that did this, as well. And so I wrote to him and I said, "Can I use these in my CD? I want to use the images," and he gave me permission to do that. So I thought it'd be kind of cool. So got a little text excerpt, and you got an image from this artist, and then my, music, and I thought that's kind of an interesting thing, and I started thinking, "Well, it'd be really great if somehow I could make a chamber ensemble piece with these instruments, because I have them all together, be really cool if they could play together." And so I started thinking about ways I could do that, like, maybe I can write a piece that uses, kind of material from each of the pieces and kind of weave it together. I just kind of didn't like, well, what happens if you have a different instrument, you want to put that in there, and I'm kind of doing that. I'm actually selecting instruments that are, in this chamber piece. I thought I don't want something that's that strict. So this is where the open form concept came to me, and I thought, I like Earl Brown. I'm really interested in those works of his, like Available Forms, and I conducted a couple of his pieces. Um, and I started thinking, well, that maybe that's the way to do it, is have this kind of open form piece where the soloist in this group improv, they will be playing excerpts from their own individual solos, and they'll be acting as their own characters. So they're essentially representing their character in this improvisational kind of format. And the way it was set up was there would be duos, trios, and quintets among the group. And so it'd be like a party. So like you got this party and you've got a couple people talking, and then some third person comes in there, kind of interrupt, and maybe they divert the conversation. Maybe somebody interrupts and it's like another group takes over. I thought this is basically a set of these conversations and these kind of interactions like at a party. And then each character would be represented by that instrument. And we did that the first time in 2016, and I called that Canetti-Menagerie, and it was for 5 to 8 players. There was this whole setup where you combine in 2s and 3s and 5s. Eventually, I added one section where all the players could play if there were up to 8 people. So, when we've done that, I don't know, maybe 10 times, I guess, in different versions. And the great thing about it was that you could put this thing together in very little time. So if all the performers are learning their own solo pieces, and you say, "Hey, let's just get together with these 5 people or 6 people or whatever, and put this, Canetti Menagerie together. We'll do this little group improv. It lasts about, 7 to 10 minutes, something like that, depending on how many players there are." And when we performed it in 2016, I did the thing like I did in the previous performance where I would read excerpts of the text, and then they would play the solo pieces. And what we did was we made it an evening long program, and we had lighting. So each of the instruments, when they were playing, the light spotlight would go on them, different colors. Eventually, we added the projections of the images that we have from Canetti. I commissioned an artist, a photographer, to do some images based on the characters that we were doing. And so we did another performance with these images projected, and it became this kind of theater thing, like an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half long. with an introduction and a conclusion kind of text that was read by the narrator. And then we flanked the in solo pieces with these two Canetti-Menagerie improvisations. So the format was such that you'd have this introduction, short introduction by the narrator, then this group improvisation based on these Canetti characters, with the audience doesn't really know what's going on. They don't recognize the characters, but they recognize certain, or they'll hear certain elements that may stand out. Then in the course of the piece, as each of the solo works is presented, each of the characters is presented, the solo performs, you'd start to hear fragments from, or like parts of it that you heard in fragments at the beginning. And then at the very end, we do another Canetti-Menagerie with everybody. By that time, all the characters have been introduced as solo instruments. And then you hear them come together at the end, and people would start to recognize, like, oh, I remember that in the solo percussion piece when that happened, and now how it's kind of interacting with these other instruments. And that became kind of a thing that we were doing. We were touring it. We took it on a tour in Texas and Oklahoma. We had one set up for the upper Midwest. It was going to be a trip between Grand Forks, North Dakota, and Chicago. We had several schools set up. That was in 2020, so that got canned because of COVID, and we never really got a chance to pick that up again. But what I did after that is I went to NIU. I was had a residency there, Northern Illinois University. I had just composed a solo trombone piece for the director of the music school there, Andrew Glendenning, and he invited me out there, and we did a performance with a group of their performers on the NIU faculty. And this is where I was the first time we did it, where I just showed up. They'd already been practicing their pieces, and then we put together the menageries in like 45 minutes. And we do essentially it's kind of like just add water, and this show comes together. And it was fantastic. It's on my YouTube page, so people can hear that, the whole show with the narrator. But it made me aware of the fact that, like, this is something that I don't need to have my own group that goes around and plays it. I could go to a place that has a bunch of soloists, and we put this thing together and make an evening long program out of it. So it turned out to be an incredibly practical game plan for a piece and an entire program, which I really wasn't thinking about when I first did it. But it's like, as it kind of evolved, it kind of came together. It turned out to be a pretty cool project. I'm still planning these things, as opportunities come up.
I love this concept a bunch. As you may remember, my composition jury was a big theater thing with slideshows and art and all that kind of thing. So I have always been really interested in upping the dramatics of concert music. I kind of always still feel that modern society needs that these days for our attention.
Yeah, it stimulates the audience in numerous ways, right? You get the visual arts, you get the literary reference, you get the music, you get the kind of theatrical aspect of it. I mean, I think it's a really, we live, like you say, we live in a society that's like very much, we're bombarded by stimuli from different media and everything like that. So take advantage of it.
Yeah, and to your explanation, it also helps the audience to understand the piece, because they start to learn these characters, and kind of my favorite part is the menagerie part, because I like chaos of it in some of my music. I love the improvisation. It's so cool to come up with this idea and this concept of, I'm gonna take all these individual solo pieces that are written 30 years in timelines of nothing, and find a way to mash them all together that comes off with making a lot of sense, you know, because of that. And I really just, I fell in love with that concept. I thought that was really awesome.
It's one of those things that actually worked. Like, I wasn't even planning the kind of, like I say, the practical aspect of it, but it worked a lot better than I was expecting. It took me a few years to kind of think about ways of making a chamber piece, so I'm glad the way it came about, that it actually has been pretty effective. And it's been interesting for the performers too, as you mentioned, the improvisational aspect of it, 'cause, um, it's important to work with players who can improvise. So, like, and to find players that are really good readers and can play written music well and also have the improvisational background can be a little challenging. But it's also been really fun to kind of see how people involve themselves in this, and also just how the thing kind of flows, because I tell them, just pretend like you're at a party. So you might be obnoxious and just walk in the middle of a duo conversation and just kind of interrupt it, so you can be that guy. or you could be the person that's, maybe the two characters are kind of arguing and then they kind of come to agreement at some point. So even in the context of the improvisation, players will kind of share material. So they might have their own distinctive material from their solo pieces, but as they're playing, they start to kind of like play each other's material or play around with each other's material. So it's like if you were having a conversation with somebody and they might be coming from two different perspectives, and by the course of the conversation, they start to have this agreement or understanding and they more aware of each other. That was actually a really cool thing too. And the other thing I was going to mention was Elizabeth McNutt, who's my colleague here, and she now directs the Nova Ensemble. She took it over after I stepped down, and I wrote a solo piccolo piece for her in this set, and she's a really great improviser. She does a lot of improvisation. She said this is a really weird task for improvisation because she said normally you're kind of like doing whatever, but she says not only are you giving me the material to work with, like specific material that's in my solo piece, but I also have to play this character. Like I have to play it in a certain way and behave a certain way. And so she said it really limits what I would normally do if I was improvising, where I would have like this much material I could work with. I'm actually working in this kind of narrow band, which I think is actually another cool thing because it's a kind of restriction on the improvisers that they don't normally have in some other of the improvised music they might do.
Well, and I think that helps people who aren't as skilled improvisers. I'm always trying to develop ways of getting a large ensemble to be able to improvise, and that can become chaos, too, if everybody's playing at the same time. So you had all this great you have us in your score, you sort of have some suggestions of how they can ensure there's space between each other and think a little bit about the flow. So they have a sort of a form that they can either predetermine it, or if they're great improvisers and very confident, they can just go in and wing it. Again, I think all that is, at least in my experience, is something that totally works. The one thing I find with free improvisation that some audience members may have difficulty with is depending on the improvers, you may not get a lot of return source material.
Yeah, you're right.
It can get hard for people to follow, and so I've always worked with trying to come up with methods to, again, limit it to a degree so that certain source material is always coming back to sort of control that. And maybe it's from my time at UNT in the jazz. You're always sort of working with the head structure. So, but trying to transform that into a little bit more free and more of a classical too concept. So,
Right. And as you know, I mean, classically trained players are not usually improvisers unless they have had some kind of jazz background or whatever. And so, or a lot of new music performance where they've done things that are like open form works. And so in the past, when we've had a couple of the performers that were not strong improvisers, as you say, since they're playing from their own solo piece, they have some material to work with, and so at least it's not like, "Oh my gosh, what am I gonna do?" It's like, I'm just pulling things out of the blue, I don't even know where to begin. They could just pick a place in their score, in their own solo piece, and then develop that, and they can repeat things and play things in different octave and add trills or do some coloration to it or whatever, and so, in a way, it's kind of gives them the liberty it gives them enough structure that they don't feel like they're completely left out to sea, but they also then have the liberty to kind of play around with the material a little bit. It's actually worked out really well. And then they're inspired by the really good improvisers of the group who kind of kind of go off script quite a bit, and they might go a little bit away from the material, and it kind of allows them to feel that they can do the same thing.
yeah, I think that just helps with the comfort level there. And to me, brings back improvisation because, like, it's a 300-year-old classical tradition. Much of the music was like, "Here's a shape, now go improvise, add color, do things, make it better." It sort of brings that element back, which, again, right in my wheelhouse of desire. I like having the soloist be able to not be limited to my notes and, like, color it, baby. Add some
Yeah.
flourish, add more, go, go. You're the star here. Go
Yeah.
do what you like. But then I just have a guiding structure too, so it still sounds like the same piece, and they have,
Right.
like, what to work with the material. So,
Yeah, and I think that part of the tradition of classically trained players is that, everything's written out, and so they don't wanna do something wrong, they wanna do it
yeah.
right, and, like, what does the composer want? And so, like, jazz players are used to, taking liberties and everything, and, of course, the old joke is, like, if you play a mistake in a jazz solo, you do it again, it'll make it part of the solo, right? You kind of like
Mhm.
you integrate it into the solo. And so if it's done once, it sounds like a mistake. If it's done a few times, it's, organic part of the solo. And I think they kind of learn that a little bit. The other thing I was going to mention, you were talking about a structure. And one of the things that's been really helpful, and I did this with the first group, I realized, okay, this is the way to do it, is I just give them this little roadmap. It's basically I use an Excel spreadsheet, just have these little colors that show, and numbered columns, 1, 2, 3. It just shows the different combinations of instruments. And so they just use that as kind of like their map. And I say, it doesn't matter how long, you can go maybe 10 seconds in a duo or a trio. Maybe it's 30 seconds if you're really rocking along, but you have the flexibility to change the time. And it's been really helpful, kinda like having a net there for, like the trapeze artist with a net. It gives them a sense of security, like where they are in the improv, and yet they can still take a lot of liberties within that roadmap, right?
Yeah, I saw that in the score or an example of it in the score. It made a lot of sense to me. As soon as I find the time, I'm gonna revise this piece I wrote called 10 Circles because it didn't have enough space in it, for where I wanted it. I had certain points that definitely, did those things, but overall, listening the entire piece, I realized, it's just not enough. So I need to come back and figure out how to add more space because it's really important in
Yeah.
improvised music. So
For sure, and that's another thing in the process of these performances is realizing that, like, oh, you gotta build that in. That's one of the reasons why I intentionally made it to where there's duos, trios, and quintets. Gotta figure, okay, when the quintet's playing, it's gonna be a little bit of a free-for-all, a lot of mayhem in there. But when it's a duo, it can be very delicate and very nuanced, right? So you can actually the having a kind of changing in textures like that gives it a little bit of breathing space that happened in the course of the performance.
I find that always important, to not only help the more congested sections so that they feel like, that's an important piece or important atmosphere being congested, and because if you don't have quieter sections, then the loud doesn't sound loud. If you don't have thin textures, then you don't get the impact of the thick textures.
Exactly. And it just becomes this kind of like, this dense mass that goes from the beginning to the end.
Right, right, and then you lose all the impact that you may be
Right.
trying to do. Like, yeah, at least these are my opinions, but
No,
obviously you agree probably because you taught me this stuff.
yeah. Well, but also I think you had the experience from living the experience, and you've been in those situations and we learn from those experiences and the things that don't work. It's like you make a mental note like, okay, am I gonna do that again? Or how am I gonna fix that so it doesn't happen the next time? And these are all, it's a lot of trial and errors involved with that as well.
Yeah, nothing really beats experience. That's why I had such a good experience at Nova, group ensemble, and how I'm always really encouraged to just keep playing music as much as I can because it helps my own composition
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny, I was kind of in a period of, languishing a little bit compositionally, mostly because as I'd been chair for so long that it was the administrative work was kind of taking a lot of my time, and I was finding I was kind of in this lull, this kind of the, doldrums period as a composer, and I just started playing bassoon. This is about 12 years ago. I thought it was the summer. I was at work in the summer and I thought I'll just play bassoon a little bit just to have fun and dust off the instrument, everything like that. And within a couple weeks, it was like the gears started going, almost like it unblocked this compositional blockage I had. And I have to say, it's like ever since that time I've been composing pretty regularly. So it was kind of like just getting out your instrument and playing just really frees things up and makes you think about things in a different way, and so, that's if I have that situation again, I know just to dust my bassoon off and start playing again.
Yeah, it's nothing gives you fresh ideas or ability to change your perspective when you're stuck on something like
Yeah.
playing somebody else's music makes a
Yeah, for sure, definitely, that gets very inspiring that way.
yeah. But anyway, I was very inspired by these works, and it's always great seeing, someone else really pursue these type of, open-ended forms and mixing improv back into classical music, so
Yeah, well, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about these.
oh, definitely my pleasure, my pleasure.